each person will talk about their companies and their background. And so what I might do is I might do this in company alphabetical order. And part of the reason I'm saying that is because it allows me just to comment that in advance of today's session, I was munching on some Chiwis last night. And so it's a great opportunity for me to share that. But why don't we kick things off? What I'm going to do is I'm going to have each one of us to introduce ourselves and our companies, what we do, and then we'll dig in from there. So I'm going to start with Sarah, who leads Chiwis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Keith, and the Spring community for having me with this good group. My name is Sarah Goodman. I'm the CEO and founder of Chiwis. We are a BC-based snack brand that makes fruit chips from ugly fruits, so misshapen fruits. We don't add anything. They're just like a really good, mess-free, allergen-free whole food snack that I launched as a solopreneur in February of 2021, and now we're going into our 5th year in Canada, in grocery stores mostly, and we launched into the US market just a bit under a year ago.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. And then I'll go over to Felix with ChopValue.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for having me. My name is Felix. I'm the CEO and founder of ChopValue Manufacturing. We are a microfactory concept that started recycling chopsticks for a living for a viable circular economy. We've scaled that quite a bit around the world. We are currently operating in 9 countries. We have over 80 of these microfactories in development or open, and have transformed I think over 210 million chopsticks to date into new product. We've now launched a mother brand of ChopValue called MVP. From the startup world, minimum viable product, but we call it the microfactory venture platform because we have developed quite some IP over the last few years to look at how we can deploy our microfactory concept into other resource streams to tackle the real problems. So excited to talk about expansion and especially the US impact today.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, leading Granted, Stephanie Sang.
Right, I'm Stephanie Sang. Some people like to call me the grant angel of Canada. I like to give away money that's not mine. Our firm is largely focused on helping small businesses access government grants in Canada. And I'm happy to say that we made impact with both Chiwis and with ChopValue. So I'm excited to be on this call and with Spring. And so excited to be on this call with all 3 of you.
Amazing. Thank you for all of that. And so as we kick things off, there's a couple of things that I would like to share to the audience. First one is if at any point in time you have a question, please put it into chat. And we would love to take those on the fly as they come up. At the end, we'll probably have some Q&A time as well. So if you did want to come off of mute to ask your question, we'll definitely have space for that. Last but not least, please don't hesitate to introduce yourself in chat. So share your name, share your company, share where you're from. It also helps all of us as panelists to also know some context of who you are and where you're from, and maybe give us some ideas for kind of how to shape some of our content as well. So yeah, just pop that in to the chat and we'll go from there. So great, without further ado, I'm going to start to dive into some questions that I have that I'm really going to use to prompt the conversation. And I'm going to pick each person in turn to kind of kick off a question and use this as an opportunity to seed the Q&A as well. So my first question with Felix and also with Sarah is, you've both gone to different forms of global expansion. And so I guess my first question is, and I'll start maybe with Sarah and then over to Felix, is, as an early stage entrepreneur, what is your perspective on how quickly or how soon you think an entrepreneur should be thinking about global expansion and why? So maybe Sarah, over to you.
Okay. Well, when I first started, I didn't think about it at all. I thought, how do I had no experience in the grocery food industry. I came from tech where I first met Keith. And I just thought, how do I get this product onto a store shelf?
Mhm.
And at first I was manufacturing, started with kiwi chips, something that I used to make for outdoor adventures all the time. I was making them in Squamish in a tiny kitchen and realized it was a terrible business idea. I needed to find partners that could help me scale up. And I ended up finding partners that were located close to where these fruits are grown, which, you know, we don't grow a lot of kiwis in Canada. So I originally had some manufacturing partners that were not domestic because that was the only way to be able to scale. And it wasn't until maybe like year 3 that I thought, oh, well, it's actually quite expensive to be shipping our products that are being packed in BC and the lower mainland to Toronto on the East Coast. It's actually quite cheap, a lot cheaper to be selling them into California. And that's when I started looking into the opportunities there and what that looked like. And I
Mm.
think as an entrepreneur, when you're like, ooh, like there's 30 million people in California, like I can make so much money. There was a lot of like carrots dangling where you think everything's going to be quite streamlined and you'll make more money. And I've definitely learned a lot about entry into that region that a lot more expensive and time consuming and a different operates differently than in Canada. But I think it wasn't until probably year 3 where I was like, oh, like, could this be a thing? Because, you know, we still haven't tackled all of Canada, but it was more like, do we go East Coast or do we go west of the States?
Mm. Yeah, well shared. Well shared. Thank you. Felix, your perspective. When were you thinking about global expansion?
You know, I came from academia and industry, and I think from day one, ChopValue was for me all about expansion. You know, I wanted to not create. I didn't want to fall in love with a product that I couldn't expand and actually tackle an issue on a global scale. It's funny to say that, you know, we're tackling chopsticks as a fairly small resource that I would say is rather neglected or underutilized. But for me, it was more about the model, like the model behind on how we are transforming an underutilized resource from stick to the value engineered designed end product. So really from day one, I think in week 3, I maybe have said it out loud the first time to people that I think I'm going to franchise the concept. And they were like, yeah, no, that's too expensive. You're never going to make it. But to me, it was the only way where I could stay true to myself, that I want to scale our technology to the actual problem case. I've looked up to too many brands and beautiful products that have succeeded in their own local markets, turning a waste stream into maybe a new material, but couldn't break out of that, you know, local art piece or that project by project thinking. I really wanted to make sure we developed only something that can expand globally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that that's really an important part of this conversation is like, why are we doing what we're doing? And one thing that I would note for the audience is, you know, Sarah and Felix have both been expanding outside of Canada. The origin point was different, you know, and I think that that's actually very common. You know, sometimes people are deeply committed to global expansion day one, and sometimes it actually is something that emerges over time. And I think either approach is actually entirely fair and valid. And so I think, given that you both have been going through this process of expansion, you know, what do you think is you know, based on your experience and what you've seen of other entrepreneurs, what do you think is the first thing every entrepreneur should be doing when thinking about expansion? What is that first step or the first steps that they really should be, you know, digging into?
Sarah, maybe I go quickly first because I can find the bridge to Steph, because I think that the very first step is to find your local community, your local champions, and a really, really strong foundation in the market that you're starting first. You know, like proof of concept is not just your economics in the local market. It's also like, who do you work with at what stage of the business? And for us, that was, for example, at the very beginning, Steph, you know, it's like, who knows your strongest founding market best, that you can just feel very supported around you, so that once you have built that team and built these partnerships, you as the visionary can actually focus on that expansion mission, which will consume so much of your capacity on new learnings. And that to me is what kind of puts you up for success.
Yeah, well shared. Well shared. I'd love your perspective, Sarah, and then Steph, I'm going to have like an add-on question directed at you. Yeah.
I think for us, initially really figure out who our customer was. Going back even before that was when I was thinking about starting Chiwis on the evenings and weekends, still working at tech, was doing competitive analysis. And that wasn't just in Canada. That was, does this product exist anywhere? Who would be the competitor if we were to go into the States? And a lot of them were that are considered still our competitors, or like similar products are there. So figuring out if the product was out there and if it was something that was worthwhile doing, and then figuring out who would buy it and who that target customer was. And then when you're thinking about expanding, well, is that target customer in this region? So even when we were thinking about going into the States, and like, yes, we think in California, we have a similar type of customer demographic as we do in BC, or with our main consumer demographic. And then actually going there and looking at these different stores. Like I remember when we launched into Costco in LA and Hawaii, we had done Costco BC and Alberta with our Kiwi chip, and it was really did really well. And we launched into LA and Hawaii. We didn't go to the stores before. We're like, oh yeah, this is a similar customer. I remember the day we launched, we were there on the ground, and I realized this is a very different customer than a Costco Canada customer. And that's like, and it didn't do as well. And that's one thing that we should have done. We should have gone and looked and really like spent time in those stores to understand if that was going to be a similar experience to Canada or not.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic sharing. Steph, one thing that I was thinking about as Felix was sharing, and I think it dovetails really nicely into what Sarah was sharing as well, is you have worked with a lot of entrepreneurs over time, and you've seen a lot of people go through this market expansion. What would you add to that checklist of like, what do people need to think about, or where have you seen people be successful in global expansion, either in terms of network or learnings or access? Like, give your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like a lot of companies in Canada are very ambitious, right? They feel similar to what Sarah's saying, like, hey, we've got a customer here. There's probably someone like that out there. The ones that I find that are most successful actually have interest already from that market. So somebody who's in that market, who's come to you, they're a distributor, or they've seen your product and they're like, we don't have anything like this out here. We've been looking for something like this. And they're almost like your champion to take your product into some of the stores and going through some of that market testing that Sarah's talking about, whether it's at a Costco, which is, first big go hard, into that market, or whether it's just at a local retailer and just seeing, kind of what are people looking at? What is the pricing of this? And playing around a little bit with that tends to garner stronger product market fit when it comes to expansion, and a more structured way of expanding. So maybe out of the 10 products that you sell, 4 of them are the ones that you really should be bringing in, not all 10. And so those types of market tests really do make a difference.
So for the three of you, and I'm kind of curious of your respective approaches on this. You each have talked about what I'll use Sarah's term, market entry, right? And in particular, how you have viewed and how you think about market entry and how you implement, for lack of a better term, maybe even a market entry checklist. So Sarah, you talked about market entry and thinking or rethinking market entry, like using the California market as an example. Felix, you talked about how you weren't just thinking about like the end product, but you were thinking about your platform and like how you are enabling internally how to do, market entry. And then Steph, you talked about like competitive intelligence, market intelligence, and customer intelligence, riffing off of what Sarah said as well. What do you guys think needs to go on to a market entry checklist or a market entry launch plan? What are those like top 3 to 5 things that you think need to be on that list? And Felix, I'm going to pick on you to go first because you're smiling. So there's clearly something there.
Yeah, Keith, I was smiling because I had no answer, because I'm thinking about but the first thing that comes to mind is demand. Is there a demand for your solution or your product? In our space, I would argue, in every urban environment in every city around the world, which has then become our vision. We think every city around the world deserves a microfactory because there is a demand to turn an underutilized waste stream into a resource stream and use our blueprint for circular manufacturing to make a beautiful product out of it. So I would always start with the demand, making sure that that's there, and you're not, maybe in love with a market that just sounds fancy, and you want to be in Paris, Amsterdam, New York, and Seoul for no reason. So I don't know, I'm not going to find like a bad example, but for example, if you, maybe I'm doing it anyways. So if you're launching a beauty product and then you're launching that in Canada, and I'm not sure if Canada has the reputation of launching beauty products, and you're launching that in Korea, like I'm not sure if this is the right move, right? So this is just one very simple example of be aware of that checklist. Number 2 for us is talent and resource availability. Resource availability in general, and then resources are talent, supplies, materials, equipment, people. And then number 3 is what I love about starting a company in Vancouver is diversity in language. If I would have started that in my home country, we would be 8 out of 10 people would be men coming from an engineering or trades background, and they would all speak the same language, and they will all look similar to me. When you're in Vancouver, we have a team now that speaks 17 different languages and can service every part that we have expanded to around the world so far. It's quite phenomenal. I think this is pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's a great starting point on a market entry checklist or plan, like in consideration. So I think that's great. Sarah, what would you add to that list?
So yeah, the first is definitely the competitive analysis. And then it's well, there's a couple that are really important. For a consumer packaged goods company selling into grocery stores in a different country, what are the requirements for labeling? Like, how are you going to ensure that you don't market into or go into a region and immediately have your bags pulled because of some kind of FDA reliance? So we work with a regulation consultant before we launch any product, and we do a full package review. Even like barcoding can be different there for different things like cases. So that's another big one. And then how are you going to get this product onto store shelves? So there's distribution, there's brokers, you're not there on the ground, you don't have these relationships with retailers. So who's going to help you do that, and how much cut are they going to take? And what is left to actually market to get that product off the shelves, because no one knows you there. Are you going to be doing it digitally and getting brand awareness and sending your brand information to people's phones? Or are you going to do like demos consistently? And so it can be really exciting when a Whole Foods wants to put you into 150 stores in California, but once you're on there, the time's ticking for you to get that product off the shelf. There's so many different things to think about. It's not just getting the business in CPG. It's a long timeline of marketing capabilities and customer research. There's so many different aspects, and a lot of different people have to help you along the way. So making sure your margins are okay for all of those types of things, so that it's successful and doesn't just fizzle out.
Well, I actually just 2 things that I'm going to call out. One is, as many of we work with entrepreneurs and we work with investors. When we think about market expansion, to your point, Sarah, we also think about regulatory, legal, and tax, right? Because if you want to have investors investing across border, those are key considerations, right? And then the final thing too is I loved how you talked about cost structure. Now, for you and for Felix, you guys have physical product that you're working with, and so cost structure is really important. But I would argue when we're talking about software companies, we're talking about mixed product companies, cost structure is always there. What are your price points? What are your costs? What's your cost base? To your point, Sarah, like you start to increase like those market entry costs around marketing, social media, sales, enterprise sales, depending on the product, right? And so these are all really critical considerations. What would you add to this market entry checklist, Steph?
So one that often people don't think of is IP. And they think, oh, I'm a technology product, so I don't need IP. Or I'm a whatever food product, and so I don't need IP. But even trademarking your brand, I did come across a client before we started working with them where they realized that there was a trademark on their product name in the US, and they were already selling, and then they got this cease and desist letter and they had to unwind everything they did. And that's
Mhm.
awful, right? So
A-
making sure
And
that is
expensive.
in place.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Yeah.
expensive. And it does
Yeah.
make you wonder, kind of, are people going to even remember the brand that you came out with originally? And so having to rebrand is a big issue, especially if you're trying to do it in a new market, where you've already grown some traction. And I will also just highlight like what Felix said about resources. I can't tell you how many companies we work with where they're two people and they're like, yep, we're going to expand into the US and we're going to go and do this. And I'm like, well, do you have customers still here? It's like, yeah, well, who's going to manage this while that person's going to travel? And, there's customers that are here that need to be managed and things to be packed. And there's only two of you. And so that's the other thing that I would say is like human resources is a thing, especially when you're a
Mhm.
smaller micro business, and to really, consider whether or not you have the capacity before you actually go out there, whether it's
Mhm.
financial capacity or human resources or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's well shared. I have actually one more question that I'd like to ask the three of you before we tackle that elephant in the room that I think everybody's probably thinking about. And that is Felix and Sarah, and maybe I'll start with you, Sarah. When you were starting to think about expansion outside of Canada, how were you thinking about funding that? And what have you learned since you started that process?
I had raised around, and part of the use of funds was to expand into the west of the states, and not, we're going to throw spaghetti at the wall and go everywhere. I've always had a very minimal approach to it, because I've talked to a ton of founders in CPG who, had that, oh my gosh, I can make so much money. There's so many more people. Everyone will like my product. And then they get with a distributor like UNFI
Mhm.
and they say, sure, I got national acceptance from Sprouts. I'm going to go into all these different warehouses where it's $500 per flavor for each warehouse. All of a sudden, you're getting invoices, or you're putting out invoices for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you're getting chargebacks for over that amount, and you're bankrupt. So that happens quite often, and I was warned about that many times.
Mhm.
So I said, I'm going to do this in a slow and methodical way. Still cost way more money than I thought. Still was like, I was naive on that part of it. I just, the use of funds to get to the US expansion was definitely not enough, especially for that marketing piece of getting it off the shelf. Because with a product like ours, I think like we launched during COVID, the branding on our bags, like it's very obvious what it is. And that helped us. Like our first account was Whole Foods in Canada, that no one knew who we were, that we're still national with them. But it does take trial and people to try the product and see it to really, because they'll think twice if they see it at $6.99. They're not going to buy it right away. So I think like for us, we probably should have budgeted a lot more for the marketing. We haven't been delisted at the stores that we've launched into in the west of the states. It's still been less than a year, but I think like to do it really, really well, even at that Costco example, every time you do a demo at a Costco, it's $500 per demo per location.
Mhm.
And maybe that would have done better if we were doing a lot more of those demos, but you still have to make money. So the marketing piece, I would have probably allocated like 25% more of the use
Mhm.
of funds for that. But yeah, long-winded answer. That was part of the funding round,
Yeah.
a big part of
Yeah.
it.
Great. Thank you. Felix, how have you viewed that? How do you fuel and fund global expansion?
So maybe for us, it's a little bit of a different mindset. We're not expanding a product into a new market. We're expanding a business model in a new market. So what we did first is we expanded from coast to coast in Canada. So we stayed within what we knew. We knew our unit economics if we're opening another city, and we also wanted that story to tell of saying, hey, we have expanded from coast to coast in Canada. Maybe we have said North America and we already talked about how we did it, and we pretty much announced that we're now ready to bring this in other urban environments around the world. We weren't really specific where, and I think we're fortunate enough by the community we've built already and with our professional contacts in the industry that we got a lot of inbound inquiries for franchising or licensing. And I think once we have sifted through this franchising, franchising was our tool to actually fund our expansion. So as we were gathering new investments of people that bought into the brand, we were able to reinvest that into building the right team as support resources, upgrading machinery, then upgrading our operating procedures. So I think the foundation was just very clear, and then that gave us this scale to raise capital, where we were able to tell the story with an existing track record. I'm a bit like, I bootstrapped this business at the first 2 years before I raised capital for the first time, and I wanted to bootstrap the expansion in at least with a limited track record before I would raise significant capital for the later on expansion, because I think it's sort of gives me this confidence as CEO that is also an engineer, to have the systems in place that I feel really comfortable and confident that it works.
Thank you. Now I'm going to use my direction to Steph also as a way for us to start to address this elephant in the room, the elephant in the room being tariffs, being at a federal election, economic uncertainty, all of the things that are happening in the world right now. Yes, have not said his name. But the important part here is, Steph, you have helped a lot of companies to fuel expansion through the use of grants. What role do you see that playing? And then maybe a comment from your perspective as to what you think we might expect to see coming out of the election.
Oh. If I had a crystal ball, oh my goodness. So, I mean, I think that we've been very fortunate in the last few years. There's been a lot of spending on the government front. And I think that that's going to start slowing down. Now, having said that, we were born at Granted out of economic, change. So Granted started in 2011, and that was after the whole, 2008 economic downturn. And then that's when the government finally got some programs out there to help businesses. And then when a little bit of a dip in 2017, we saw another, bunch of funding come through. And then obviously during COVID, everybody got a piece of that as well. So I think that it's more on, from the government perspective, like really looking at what actually is going to help Canada continue to grow. What's interesting is there are some very unique programs that are coming out. So this morning, my research team just brought to my attention, and this may or may not be relevant to any of the businesses on here, but Proteins Canada has this program where if you change your source of ingredients to a Canadian source, they're going to fund that development of that so that you're buying more Canadian. And they recognize the challenge of having to make a change in your ingredients. So they're going to fund 75% of that change. Now, it's very specific to plant-based because they're Proteins Canada. And so, it's niche. But those are some of the interesting things that we're seeing right now are, EDC got $5 billion in funding to help Canadian companies be able to look at export markets a little differently. FCC, which is Farmers Credit Canada, and EDC is Export Development Canada. So Farmers Credit Canada got another $1 billion to help with companies that are really facing tariff threats as a way of threatening the livelihood of a lot of the farms and the food processors out there. So we're just seeing program dollars being put in those different ways. Can Export just relaunched. It used to be that you could apply for 75% to $75,000. That's now down to 50%. $50,000. And I will say that it's interesting. They said if you go to the US, you can only go to the US. If you go outside of the US, you can only go outside of the US. You can't have a blended application of, I'm going to spend $25,000 in the US South, and then I'm going to go and spend $25,000 in Germany. They're not allowing that this year. So also seeing kind of how will the government then allocate that spending between US spend versus international will be very interesting, because the whole idea is to diversify Canadian businesses away from one key market. And so we'll see kind of how well they do there.
Yeah, those are all excellent examples. And I think to your point, regardless of who wins the Canadian election, there have always been granting programs for as long as all of us have been in business, for sure. And so there will continue to be programs. Now, where the emphasis is and where the dollars get put, I think is important. One thing that you've told me, Steph, recently that is probably worth highlighting here is that some of the government departments are also setting money aside and not offering it yet until they get to the other side of clarity, which could be some combination of the election and tariffs. Any commentary you want to add there?
Yeah, so every year there's a budget provincially and then federally. And so these are all government dollars that we're talking, right? So not foundations. And so this year we've noticed a big boost in both BC and Alberta, who've already announced their budget for the year, where they're putting billions of dollars in what we call a contingency fund. And so this is an ability for the government to move ideally a little quicker than having to go through, Parliament or whoever else that they need to get permission from to be able to make spending dollar decisions. And we don't know where the end of this tariff thing is going to be or what direction it's pointed at. Depends on the day. And so the election will be key, but these are provincial dollars, right? So this is just within BC or Alberta at this point in time. I would expect that those dollars will be allocated to support small business, whether it's in manufacturing. I mean, really, manufacturing does need more of a push. Clean tech, depending on who comes in government, may or may not be prioritized at the same level. But definitely helping small businesses be able to get out of potentially this rut that people are expecting over the next few months with just the uncertainty that's out there is important to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's well shared. I think it'll be interesting to see as well, once we get through the other side of the federal election, see the next steps of tariffs, whatever those next steps may be. And then there's also that understanding that the federal and provincial governments will, with that contingency fund, they'll need to deploy it in some way, shape, or form. And they'll have a less time to be able to do that. And so
That's
that
right.
actually could present some interesting opportunities for companies as we go through. So, so thank you for sharing that. Now, elephant in the room. Tariffs, they're a thing, they're not a thing. I'm going to completely date myself here, but I'm doing it for a point, which is when the recession of the late 1980s, early 1990s happened, which for some of us feels like forever ago, and some of you weren't even born yet, which is also cool. But when that recession happened, it happened in the US first. And then there was this kind of negative halo effect on the Canadian economy. And I still remember actually where people were talking about, wow, it's time for Canada to reduce our reliance on the US. And so here we are, fast forward almost 40 years later, and here we are again. And so I guess the question that I want to kick things off with for Felix and Sarah is, do you consider this tariff threat or tariff reality, depending on how it's impacting you right now, do you consider it to be a bit of a siren call for you to be like, I need to make sure I'm fully diversified, or do you actually view it in a different way and why? So I'd love to get your perspective on that. And I'm actually going to allow either one of you to start off, because I feel like that might trigger a bit of thought, required first. So there you go. So whoever wants to go first.
I'll
Great.
go.
Great. Thank you.
It's been a roller coaster of emotions since all of this was set into place. I think a ton of people in the CPG space are heavily affected. I know a lot of brands who have created massive manufacturing plants in Canada and export a lot to the States. And, it's just been like, it's on, it's not on, it's not, it's not on. I was just in California earlier this month at the biggest food trade show. And, I was talking to a potential buyer about it, and she looked at her phone. Oh, they're off again. Like, we've been kind of like set in this motion of, while we're trying to focus on building a business, also focusing on strategy that's changing every 10 days. So it's for sure for us. Like I mentioned earlier, we do have some manufacturing that's in the US, and we do have some domestic manufacturing. And for us, for our US customers, we're not exporting to them, so that isn't a worry, but it's our importing for our Canadian customers that could hinder us. So we are working on looking at domestic solutions, but they are not cheap, and it does take time. And so it's taken up a lot of mental space and time that would have been spent on other things. But like even at this trade show, just so people know how, I guess Americans in the West are feeling, whenever anyone would come by our booth and we would talk to them and we would say, like, oh, you're Canadian, they would all say, oh, we're so sorry. Everyone,
Yeah.
even some people who
Yeah.
I've been talking to say, like, even packaging manufacturers and people that we've worked with in the States, they apologize constantly over email. We're now looking at other export opportunities as well, because we don't want to have that reliance fully on the West. So we're talking to Costco in Taiwan. We're talking to some European retailers who love Canadian products. So it is diversifying for sure. But there's a lot like that's looming that we don't know about yet. And so it's kind of taking it day by day for us, and I think a lot of other brands.
What do you think would help you as you explore these new markets? You know, like what would help you to kind of go from exploration to plan? Like if you were to kind of wave a magic wand and say, if I were to ask the ecosystem to help me go from exploration to plan, what would you ask for? What would you wish for?
Well, I honestly didn't have these opportunities until 3 weeks ago when I was at this trade show where people from all over the world come in. And so those opportunities were presented and were really exciting. And so I'm in the planning phase now, can export, going to these places and actually seeing them and seeing these retailers. That would be great. But we've worked together on that stuff. It takes time. I think that the funding piece, I know it's a protein funding piece, but a funding piece for manufacturers in Canada to be looking at more domestic solutions, even like packaging. Like a lot of us get packaging from overseas, but most things are going to the States. There's all of these little bits that are going to increase or decrease the margin slowly. And so I think government funding to explore domestic solutions is something that would be like immediately helpful. But I don't know, like on my wish list, I kind of got it by meeting these people when I did.
Well, and you've added some good things to the wish list, right? Like not only how to identify and find the customers, but the second one is how do I fund that pursuit? And how do I start to think about my product mix, my supply chain? Like it's not one thing, right? It is that stack. Now, Felix, been very interesting because for you, you've been in multiple countries now for a little while. And so as somebody who's been exporting outside of North America, how have you been viewing the world of tariffs, and how either has it changed your plans, your tactics, or your strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be tactful and don't sound too positive because I know it's a critical issue, but I mean, this whole tariff discussion has obviously fell in our lap of local manufacturing, hyperlocal sourcing, hyperlocal manufacturing, hyperlocal pricing and distribution of our products. So our phones are ringing, off the hook since the uncertainty began, but deals are still closing a little slower because people, like the ones that already work with us, they're just happy and thankful that there's no impact to their pricing or delivery times, or they can put a green check mark behind our name, but maybe they can't put a green check mark behind many other issues that they're dealing with. But I really think it goes back to our expansion philosophy that we have set in our very first impact report in 2018, where we committed to decentralization. We wanted to have distributed manufacturing. We did not want to ship raw material or end product. That was the goal. The first time we got an emotional response to that was during COVID, when everyone, even the end consumer, learned about supply chain issues. All of a sudden that technical term became a term that we all got familiar with. So that gave our brand a huge boost in 2020 and 2021. And now I see the same thing again in 2025 in the B2B space. Like we have like immediate and really significant needs to scale our manufacturing in the US, and we have all the opportunities in front of us to do so. And at the same time, the rest of the team is focusing on other areas of the world, because we're also learning that the world doesn't spin only around one political administration in the US.
But it's interesting. So for everybody, there was a recent climate tech event in Toronto. And at the climate tech event, there was a venture capitalist from Singapore. And And so the tariffs had already been announced. This was, if I'm not mistaken, it was right at the end of January. And so they were like, hey, tariffs are coming. And so here's the challenge. And it was really interesting because that VC said, hey, I understand the concern. And you also need to understand that the market for climate solutions is somewhere between 8 and 20 times greater in Southeast Asia than it is in the US market. And that was quite an eye-opening kind of data point. And so I think for me, a couple of things that I would highlight here is that what I love about what you both shared is that you're saying, hey, there are other markets first and foremost. The second thing, and Felix, you're a little bit farther down the path, but Sarah, you're saying similar thing too, which is, and there's another way to do business, right? Now, and Felix, in your case, you're actually saying, hey, maybe I fundamentally shift towards like maybe more localized or regionalized, which actually de-risks the business and actually creates opportunity. A friend of mine, fun fact, actually has a yarn business in Canada. And so they actually just acquired a plant in Chicago because they actually realized they don't need to produce everything in Canada. They can actually do things in different ways, right? And Sarah, you even talking the same things like sourcing raw ingredients, sourcing like supply chain materials, like packaging and other things. You can start to think about how you maybe do business differently. And I think that that's really important. So I just want to highlight for everybody who's on the call, I'm going to open it up for questions here in a minute. And so I would love for you to either pop questions into chat or be ready so you can raise your hand and then we can get you off of mute. So it's your choice whether or not you want to type it in and we can say it, or you feel free to raise your hand and then come off of mute. So I think for me, the question that I would have at this point in time is, as people are shifting their plans, they're like, and Sarah, you were fantastic. Like you were just like, it hit. We're trying to assess what it is. We're talking to customers and now we're making plans, right? Like I thought that was a great kind of flow. So for you and for Felix and for Steph alike. So Steph, I'm going to start with you on this one, but just acknowledging that I think everybody will have a contribution. As entrepreneurs are responding to and going from back foot to front foot on this topic of tariffs, global markets, et cetera, what resources do you think need to be on the must access list for founders as they're going through this process of either acceleration? So Felix, to your point, like you're accelerating, or adaptation and pivot, Sarah, what do you think is on that must access list for resources? And maybe Steph, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, grant angel, you got to look at all the grants, you got to look at all those resources, because imagine if, nobody knew who's good in marketing, in the government to say, hey, we've got dollars here, and this is exactly who should apply. And so looking at what those resources are, especially when there's those contingency funds available, where at a turn of a week, they could have a program running. And if you miss it, you miss it. So I'm always going to say, looking at that, just like, honestly, funds are really, to me, really key right now. Even doing business, we don't do business outside of Canada, but my lines of credits, looking at the loan programs, like anything that will create a little bit of a buffer in case there is an opportunity where we can jump on it. We want to be ready for it. So that, to me, I think is, this is coming from a grant and funding perspective, but definitely having that available.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Felix, over to you.
I honestly have a little trouble answering the question, Keith, because it really strongly depends on if you're shifting your business model strategy or not. So for us, that must-have resource list is obviously very different, because we're looking at local suppliers for equipment, machinery, and supplies in every country we're expanding to already. So with these approved supply lists that we're already building, that has not shifted or changed. But I think the one thing I can maybe share is Steph, I know you're on the call, but it's not all about the grants. I think it's about how sustainable is the business model in itself, past like a short-term intervention where cash can help you solve one minor problem. But other than that, sorry, I'm not sure what else I would have on my must-have resource list right now.
Well, what I love about what you just shared is actually there's different resource lists, right? Depending on whether or not you're accelerating or you're pivoting or like and adapting. And I think that that's really important. It's not a one size fits all list. The other thing is Felix said something, just so everybody knows, Steph and Felix are friends. So there's not going to be a war after this. If there's one thing I know about Steph is that Steph and I have always talked about, grants are catalytic. They're not for cash flow, right? Like,
Yeah,
and it's just really critical to know they're absolutely catalytic. It's one of the powerhouse kind of elements of the Canadian ecosystem, but we don't build a business on grants. We catalyze with grants and we build a business on a great model. And so speaking about a great and tasty model, Sarah, what would be on your must access resource list?
So right now, as a CPG brand in Canada, I'm sure most people are noticing that the Buy Canada movement is very strong. And so there's a lot of lists out there right now, like Buy North. There are Instagram and TikTok groups popping up and being a part of a bunch of these lists so people can see that you're Canadian. If you're in grocery store shelves, like having shelf talkers talking about like we're a Canadian brand to try to get in front of customers. I think grants are good. The only thing is like, if it is something that's needed right away, grants do take time. There might be a program that comes out in a week, but it might take a couple months to be accepted. For us, like we're speaking with WEOC and WeBC right now, and that's more of like a working capital marketing type push that you can have with if you're a women-owned business. And then things for us, like some of these bigger opportunities that I'm exploring that came in a few weeks ago, like some of them are quite big. So you're looking at things like PO financing, because like maybe we have been spending more time on strategy. We don't have, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. We can work with a company. If we get a Costco Taiwan PO for $400,000, we can work with our manufacturing partners. We can work with a PO financing team to be able to, one, source things that are closer to home and be able to fund these orders that will bring in the cash flow that we need to keep on growing sustainably. Because really that's the goal. The goal for us this year, it used to be, coming from tech, grow. It's more like how do you grow profitably and sustainably to survive, whatever's coming the next bunch of years and do it in a smart and methodical way.
Well said. Yeah. And key on the close there, smart and methodical, right? And I think that's really, really powerful. First, everybody, Heather made a great set of comments, I think starting to create a bit of a checklist as well around, some things that you can do if you're a clean tech company and some things to think about in the context of the US market. So just pointing that out for everybody, I think it's fantastic. I hope I'm saying this right. Alton, I hope I'm getting that right. So with the increasing reliance on free trade agreements, such as those with the EU and Australia, how can Canadian businesses effectively access these markets while minimizing logistics costs and avoiding supply chain delays? So any thoughts or insights about how you would approach some of these like emergent free trade markets like the EU and Australia, especially around logistics costs and supply chain delays?
We're working with a retailer that has retail doors in 6 European countries right now. And part of our communication and negotiation with them is that they are picking up in Vancouver and will take control of the logistics from there on. And so, because like even we've been approached by Australian retailers, but just the thought of operationally getting product over there is daunting. So we're trying to work the ability to get to these types of countries and have our product there without a logistical nightmare. And so that's one thing we're talking to, and this retailer is actually quite open-minded to it. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Well said. Thank you. Felix, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe my vision for localization is strong across all products. I feel like if I were to start any new business today, I wouldn't do it without where you have to rely on global shipping of end product. I know this is super hard for example, Sarah, for you. I don't think you wanna necessarily replicate the production process of a really good quality product with the same mindset of, how do you collect the ugly ingredients, or I'm not sure, sorry, I don't know how you call them, but it's so hard to recreate the mission for these brands, but ultimately I think that's the most sustainable pathway. So Ailton, sorry for butchering your name as well. To me, it's all about localizing your manufacturing rather than thinking, how do I ship around the world?
Well, and maybe as an extension to that, part of your model, Felix, is this kind of like what I'm going to call a hybrid kind of franchise license model, where you're partnering with people also in unique ways. So you're not just kind of like saying, oh, okay, I'm going to go global from a supply chain perspective, but also, so you're innovating around that, but you're also in a way innovating around how you partner in those ecosystems. How important is that for you around global expansion?
Yeah, we're not like, even though we have proprietary machinery and we could just say, hey, we're selling the machinery and off you go. That's not gonna work. I think we're selling the puzzle pieces that make the business model work in every market around the world, and we have replicated that over and over again now to really understand the strength of the concept. So you really scaling a partnership, and by like, franchising is really then just a tool. It's a structure that allows us to be firm in the things that we need to be firm on. For example, them following our standard operating procedures, that all the products are the same, but allowing them to still innovate in their own local markets, because Mexico has different product needs and a different product pricing than Vancouver does. Super important to not just lean back and say we're just selling machinery.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I think as we go through this process, depending on how much your organization is impacted by tariffs or economic uncertainty in general, and these like shifting sands in global trade, I do think it's important to actually take a step back and say, actually, there are a number of ways that we can adapt and innovate, right? Sometimes it's in the product itself. Sometimes it's how we set up supply chains. Sometimes it's in our business model. There's multiple ways to kind of step into that. And I think, and now is a great opportunity to kind of map through that. I'm going to start to move towards close. We have 5 minutes left. So if there are any final questions, if you want to raise your hand and come off of mute, or if you want to chat, type them into chat. Again, we would love to have them. But I'm going to maybe now raise this for the three of you as entrepreneurs. So setting aside the tariffs and so forth, all of you have gone through ups and downs. All of you have gone through uncertainty. How do you get support for yourself as a founder through these times? What are the tools or resources or community that you use to ensure that you're in the right place so you can effectively lead your team through this? And I would love to hear what each one of you think on that. And open to have whoever wants to start.
Okay, I can start. I think that it is just so important for me, my mental health, my ability to run a company that is growing, to disconnect and go outside and do things outdoors that allow me to not be thinking about strategy and all of these different what ifs, taking things day by day for sure, and having a really good support system. I've got a amazing advisory board that I go to, text basis. You can talk to whenever, when you're freaking out or just want to run something by. And then just having a good group of founders that you can chat with and commiserate with. I think that that's important. And but yeah, I think like being able to disconnect and cut it off for a little bit is important, because like we could be worrying about all this stuff all day, every day, but it's not everything. Like,
yeah, well said. Steph, how about you?
Well, Keith, you know this, I play a lot of mahjong. So that's my way of, I'm not necessarily outdoor playing mahjong, but I guess I could be if the weather permitted. Yeah, I mean, and part of the reason why I'm in this community of Mahjong is because they're all female entrepreneurs. And so we will talk a little bit of shop, and we will talk a little bit of family, and we will talk a little bit of partners and spouses and kids and all this other stuff. And so it's also reminding me of, the business is a part of my life and it's not all of my life. And so making sure that we're really kind of focused on the things that matter. And at this point, it's, my son's in first year, and one of my other kids, going into grade 8 next year. And so preparing them and making
Mhm.
sure that things are set up that way. So business is important. It's not all of what it is that we do. And so just making time for ourselves, that things that give us joy.
Yeah, well said. Felix.
Yeah, I just work, Keith. I wanted to show a picture of my dog into the camera, but I have a pretty good team, and
Oh,
I think the dog is the only one that still laughs at my dad jokes. So that's all I need right now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no, that's fantastic. I think it's so important that we each have our own outlets. Now, as we're moving towards close, I do want to highlight a couple of things. I, Felix and Sarah, both at separate points in time, you talked about the people that you have around you, the partners and the community that you have around you. And at separate points in time, you talked about Granted Consulting as being one of those places that you can go for help. I think in the Canadian context, especially as we talk about tariffs, not only Granted, I think about WeBC for women entrepreneurs. I think about Futurepreneur. I think about BDC. I would also argue if you have a great law firm and a great accounting firm, they often have resources that are available, whether it's navigating through, tax regulations, template agreements as you're looking at entering into new markets. So now is definitely the time where you also want to kind of lean in and say, hey, my law firm and my accounting firm aren't just service providers, they're also partners. There are also some incubators, accelerators who either can provide you with some guidance and some wayfinding. Some of them actually even specialize in like entering new markets. So one example I'll give everybody is an accelerator out of Norway, which is called Catapult with a K. And thank you, Felix, for coming in. But as we wrap, just noting there are some global ecosystem players that can come along alongside as well. So for Steph and for Sarah, just really appreciate the two of you taking the time to share of your wisdom and experience, but also your questions and your struggles and your opportunities. And so I just, just a lot of gratitude for sharing that with our community. We've not only gone live with this, but we've also recorded it, which means that we can actually share it out more broadly. And I think that's really important. Now is the time, I think, to build those communities that you were talking about. And I love, Steph and Sarah, you talked both about peer communities of fellow leaders and entrepreneurs. So just really appreciate you both taking the time. For everybody who's here, thank you for being a part of our community and for contributing to this session. We're definitely excited to share the journey. We will be sharing out the recording, and we'll continue to share resources, tools, learnings, and progress as we move through political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, tariffs, whatever the case may be. We are all in this together as fellow founders and leaders. And so let's support each other to not only, survive, but thrive and scale the impact we want to create. So thank you very much,
thank you, Keith.
Sarah and Steph. Yeah, thank you. And thanks,
Thanks, Keith.
everybody. We'll see you at the next
Thank you,
one.
everyone.